All right, let's get right into it. Today we're talking about English verbs, and specifically a hidden grammar rule that I promise you trips up just about everyone. It's one of those things that once you see it, you're going to start hearing it everywhere. And it all starts with this one question. I mean, we've all heard that famous McDonald's jingle a million times, right? But from a pure grammar perspective, it's actually kind of wrong. So why is that? By the end of this, you'll know exactly why it's a brilliant slogan, but might earn you a red check mark from your English teacher. You see, to solve the whole "I'm lovin' it" mystery, we first have to understand a little secret about English verbs. They basically belong to two different families, and once you learn how to tell them apart, all these weird grammar rules suddenly start to make perfect sense. Okay, so here are their official names. First, you've got your action verbs, sometimes called dynamic verbs. These are the easy ones. They describe stuff you can actually see someone doing. Then you have the non-action verbs, or stative verbs, and these are the tricky ones. They're all about internal states, feelings or thoughts that you can't actually observe. Here's my favorite way to think about it, and it really helps. Action verbs are like movies. They're full of movement, action, stuff happening, like running, talking, or playing. Non-action verbs, on the other hand, are more like photographs. They just capture a single frozen moment, a state of being, a feeling, an opinion. So what's the big guideline that separates these two families? Well, it all comes down to a really simple rule about when you can, and more importantly, when you can't, use those three little letters, ing. Getting this right is honestly the key to sounding more fluent. And here's that rule in action. Look at an action verb like walk. Saying he is walking sounds totally natural. But try doing that with a non-action verb. You wouldn't say, I am knowing the answer, would you? It just sounds off. You just say, I know. Same thing with want. It describes a state you're in, not some continuous action you're performing. Now, you might be thinking, great, do I have to memorize a giant list of all these stative verbs? And the good news is, no, you absolutely don't. They actually fall into a few pretty logical categories, which makes spotting them way easier. First up, we've got mental states and opinions. This is all about what's going on inside your head. We're talking about verbs like know, believe, understand, and remember. These all describe a state of mind, not some physical action you're doing. Next up, emotions and feelings. This category is huge. It's got verbs like love, hate, want, and need. The key here is to remember that you feel an emotion. You don't do an emotion. It's a state you happen to be in. Our third category is all about possession. This covers verbs like have, own, possess, and belong. When I say something like, this pen belongs to me, I'm just stating a static fact, right? It's not an ongoing action. And finally, we have senses. Think about verbs like see, hear, smell, and taste. When we say that flower smells nice, we're describing a quality of the flower, not an action the flower is performing. And actually, this idea of sense verbs leads us perfectly into our next section, where things get, a little weird. Because, of course, just when you think you've got it all figured out, English loves to throw a curveball. It turns out some verbs can actually be both action and non-action. They're like little grammar chameleons, changing their meaning and their rules depending on how you use them. Okay, let's start with a really common one that we actually just saw in the possession category, the verb have. So, on one hand, have can be stative, meaning simple possession. I have a car. It's a fact, a state of being. But on the other hand, it can be an action verb when it means to experience something, like in I am having fun. Here, you are actively experiencing the fun. Let's look at these two sentences. Maria has 2 pets. That's just about possession. It's a state. But we are having dinner. Well, that's about the active experience of eating. It's the same verb, but the context completely changes its job. Ready for another one? Let's look at another one of those sense verbs that can be a real chameleon, taste. Okay, so when you say, the soup tastes salty, the soup isn't actually performing an action. You're just describing its quality. It's a state. But when you say, the chef is tasting the soup, now that's a clear, observable action. We see the exact same split here. The coffee having a certain flavor, that's a state. But your sister actively putting the food in her mouth to sample it, that's an action. It really does all depend on the context. Okay, one last chameleon verb for you, and it's a huge one we use all the time. think. So when you say I think, you're usually just stating your opinion or a belief. It's a mental state. But when you say I am thinking, you're describing the active mental process of considering something. Your brain is working. It's an action. So, I think he is very talented. That's my opinion, a state. But she is thinking about buying an apartment. That's the active process going on in her mind right now. Make sense, right? So, after all that, what is the big takeaway here? It's really simple, and it's this. Context is king. The sentence itself is what tells you if a verb is describing an action or a state, and that is the key to knowing if you can stick an ing on the end. And you can use this super simple mental checklist anytime you're not sure. First, just identify what the verb really means in this specific situation. Second, ask yourself, is this an observable action or is it an unobservable state? And finally, just trust that context. It will always guide you to the right answer. And that brings us right back around to I'm loving it. It technically breaks the rule, because love is an emotion, it's a state. But language is alive, isn't it? It's always evolving. And in advertising, breaking a rule is how you get people's attention. So while it's technically a non-action verb, this quote leaves us with a great final thought. Language is always changing, and today's mistake might just be tomorrow's standard rule. Thanks for tuning in.